This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I have been enthusiastically waiting to cover this bad boy. What's going on, everybody? It is Friday, and it's a very special Friday edition here on the FSWR podcast. Normally, our Friday shows cover superstars on the Superstation as part of the NWA review series. But we're in for a treat today. We're actually going to be taking a look at the fourth Clash of Champions. Yay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Save your applause for the end. It is the very first Clash under the Turner umbrella. I know for a lot of historians out there, the Turner sale was one of the more pivotal moments in WCW that sort of marked the beginning of the end. And I mentioned this before. It's crazy to think we've covered 3 years of the Crockett era, going all the way back to late 85. And here we are in the winter season of 1988. And things are definitely changing. As we'll come to learn in the impending year, it's not necessarily changed for the better. Now, as always, make sure you subscribe, comment, and like the show if you have not already. The Five Starr Wrestling Report is here on Mondays and Fridays for new content and new shows. We are on YouTube and Rumble, covering classic wrestling from the territories as well as the WWF Raw library. And we have approximately 3 more weeks until everything gets moved from Peacock to Netflix. At least, I presume the old library is moving over to Netflix. Nothing's been officially confirmed. By that point, I'm going to have to make an executive decision. Do I fork over the $7 monthly fee just to cover the Retro Raw library and continue what we've been doing on Mondays? Am I that much of a glutton for punishment? Still trying to figure that one out. But we can absolutely confirm that the Raw library will no longer be available on Peacock as of January of 2025. The rest of the classic material, I'm assuming, is going to stay put. It's been a very interesting journey throughout the last few months. Seeing all these streaming deals come up and watching as all this content bounces around to these other streaming platforms. And of course, my main concern is, well, where does the old content wind up? I would have thought the old NXT stuff would have showed up on the CW app at some point. Because that was me giving my hopes up. But we'll see what happens with the Raw footage. Again, I'd love to keep doing the classic Raw reviews because as painful as a lot of those shows are to watch, I'm having fun with it. But then again, if it's going to be the same dilemma I'm dealing with the NXT stuff, God, especially if I have to pay it for an extra service just to literally watch one thing, it's going to be hard to justify that financial investment. The benefit with having everything on Peacock is that it's one platform, so it's one monthly subscription service. Not that I'm an advocate of everything that's on Peacock, because aside from the wrestling stuff, there's really nothing else that appeals to me. Maybe with the exception of some of the Law and Order series, but it's really it, because a lot of those other shows are garbage. But I know you're not here to hear me rant about all that nonsense. What do you say we get into some of this classic stuff? We'll go ahead and begin with the NWA Clash of Champions 4. And hey, guess what? Good news. I remembered this time. I even put it on the trusty Google Calendar. Watch NWA Clash of Champions 4. Don't miss it like a dipshit and forget about it like you did in September. And you know what? I'm a man of accountability. I am willing to admit when I fuck up. I am still going to put the blame on Crockett for not advertising that last Clash of Champions. That was all on them. If they'd at least promoted one match on television in the lead-up, I might have at least taken a minute to go to the wiki page and figure out what the hell the rest of the card was. But I said I was going to attempt to do a thorough recap of most, if not all, these Clash of Champions. And I've already failed after covering the first two. To be fair, I do not remember a single match from the Clash back in September. I don't even know where the hell they taped that event. Let's see. God, I'm wondering if I even docilely mention any of this on the Saturday TBS shows. So the third Clash apparently was held in Albany, Georgia. There were apparently 3,700 people in attendance, which is still better than what AEW Dynamite does a lot of the time. And these are the results of the card. Again, going back to me neglecting a lot of the show, we had Mike Rotunda and Brad Armstrong going to a 20-minute draw for the TV title, which sounds like an absolute barn burner of a snooze fest. Nikita Koloff and Dr. Death beat the Sheepherders. Sure. Why not? Dusty Rhodes beat Kevin Sullivan. Ricky Morton beat Ivan Koloff in a Russian chain match. I do at least remember a little bit about that recent Ricky Morton run in Crockett, shortly after Robert Gibson abruptly left the territory. Like, remember they kept pairing Ricky with all these random baby faces and coming up with these lame, pitiful excuses for why Ricky wanted to team with them? And then he just left out of the blue. They never mention him again. Oh yeah, we also had Sting beating Barry Windham by disqualification in the main event for the U.S. Heavyweight title. So in retrospect, no. I didn't miss a goddamn thing of importance on that show. So here we are at the Clash of Champions 4 from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And since they like prescribing themes for these Clash events, since we are edging closer to the holiday season, it is only fitting that they title this December Clash Season's Beatings, because it is both catchy and witty. And looking here too, they also did a much better house for this Clash than they did the September one. 8,000 apparently jam-packed inside the UTC arena for this thing. And, no, to be honest, the card was not all that striking on paper. Maybe outside the main event, which they didn't even fucking advertise on TV. Morons. Probably would have drawn them a even bigger house if they'd have actually bothered to put the Horsemen and the Midnights together on camera beforehand. Or at least have them cut a promo on each other. I know I have a tendency to get a little long-winded with some of these recaps, so I'll do my best not to overextend my talking points with some of these matches. And we've already sort of preluded this Clash event with some of the discussions on the Saturday Superstation program, so again, it's not like we haven't covered any of this stuff. We did talk about the very obscure way they got to the finals of this U.S. Tag Title Tournament. Just in case you missed the Crockett review from last week, I'll give you a very quick synopsis. So they open the Clash here with the finals of the tournament. It is the Babyface Fantastics going up against another set of Babyface challengers, Ron Simmons and Eddie Gilbert. And, well, as odd as that may seem to do Babyface versus Babyface in the finals of a tournament to crown new champions, it actually wasn't originally supposed to be that way. It was supposed to be the Fantastics and the Sheepherders in the finals, but Luke and Butch already left Crockett for the WWF by this point to become the Sheepwhackers. Or the Bush Herders, whatever their fucking names changed to. The wacky dancing buffoons that like to lick people's faces. That is what they left WCW to become. So, rather than scrambling to find another heel team to put in this spot instead, i.e. Kevin Sullivan and Dr. Death Steve Williams, they just decided to reverse the decision of the semifinal round with the Sheepherders and Gilbert and Simmons. So, even though Gilbert and Simmons lost that match, they just got put back in the tournament anyway. I should also note, since we're mentioning the obscurity of some of this tag team psychology, the Simmons-Gilbert pairing, what initially began as Gilbert wanted to team with gorgeous Jimmy Garvin in order to target the Varsity Club for the Cinderblock incident that happened months back. Well, Garvin made his return to television. It looked as if they were about to have Gilbert and Garvin be a part of this tournament. And then Garvin disappeared. He just left the area again. So from literally out of nowhere, we started getting pre-tapes where Gilbert was putting over Ron Simmons and then talking about how they wanted to go after the U.S. tag titles now. The whole thing made virtually no sense. I still have no idea what the hell went on with that Jimmy Garvin stuff and how that whole thing fell through. But that was absolutely supposed to be the plan. So, in other words, the whole thing was a clusterfuck. And they were playing around with some new concepts on the production side of things here. Not necessarily a newfound idea here in 1988. I think we've seen them try this before. They had one of those top-down camera angles they occasionally would cut to throughout the night, trying to shoot the ring from an overhead view, which would have been fine. Problem was, it looked like they positioned the camera from atop the Eiffel fucking tower. So when you're looking down, the only thing you see are these small, tiny dots moving around. You can barely tell what the hell was going on. I was actually getting motion sick a few times looking at it. The crowd was really the main story of this whole match. Because technically, this is a very, very good professional wrestling match. Easily the second best match on the card, right behind the main event. Here's the problem, though. It was babyface versus babyface on paper, and because Eddie was the home state hero, so to speak, well, the Tennessee fans were very pro Eddie Gilbert and Ron Simmons here, which basically meant for the very first time in their entire careers, WCW managed to turn the Fantastics heel for one night. The only time Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers were hated in their entire careers. That was pretty much the tale of the tape. It was a steady back and forth match. All four guys looked great here. It's kind of unfair to say there was ever really a heat sequence to this match, at least up until the closing minutes when Eddie Gilbert was having his arm worked over. But it was good attention to story detail because Bob Caudle and JR talked about Gilbert's previous history with the left arm. He's had a series of injuries take place, so that was always going to be one of the weaker components to Gilbert's offense. So towards the end, after Gilbert posted himself, they had a really great story where the fans are rallying behind Gilbert to stay alive and keep fighting through the pain. And the Fantastics, while yes, still being professional in the way they targeted Gilbert's arm, well, they still wound up getting booed anytime they cut off Gilbert from making a tag or just working him over, period. And the other thing with the crowd, too, and they really hated this early on, there were like 3 instances that happened where you see both teams start getting a little hostile towards one another. One of them would occasionally get into a brief shoving match. And like the crowd's starting to get livelier because they're like, fuck yeah, dude. Now we're going to start seeing some soup bones getting thrown. And then cooler heads would prevail. And the boys would go back to their chain wrestling or whatever. The crowd did not like this. They booed. And who could blame them? I'd have been pissed if you were teasing me with all that pent-up testosterone. Then they just turn around and start shaking hands again. The fuck, man? What is this, Make-A-Wish? Like I said, though, really good match overall. Despite the back-asswards nature of the babyface heel dynamic here. Yeah, they managed to overcome that and piece together a really well-laid-out professional wrestling match. And even though the fans shit on the finish when the Fantastics rolled up Gilbert and pinned them, the story was more so about Gilbert valiantly struggling through the pain of the arm injury and trying to hang in there as long as he could. So he was the center of attention coming out of it. And as we'll come to learn by Starrcade, Fulton and Rogers were merely transitional babyface champions so they could lose the belts to the Varsity Club. Still don't really understand why they couldn't have just had Sullivan and Williams win the belts here, but again, I'm not going to digress into a 40-minute ramble about what could have been. I guess it was more important that Dr. Death wrestled the Italian Stallion on this card instead. Yeah. Because Stallion really needed a featured singles match on a Clash card. The highlight of this segment wasn't even the match. It was Kevin Sullivan and Mike Rotunda in their pre-match promo with Jim Ross. I'm going to try to refrain from calling him retardo here. I know that's become a popular thing amongst the Rick Steiner peers. It's just... Again, it is the greatest form of heel comedy you can get. Painfully unfunny jokes from snobby, obnoxious heel pricks, where the only people that get a laugh out of it are them. Calling Steiner stupid and a moron. Talking about how he's stupid enough to think he has any chance of beating Rotunda for the TV title at Starrcade. It's Mike Rotunda's favorite low-level IQ word. Stupid. The only adjective in his dictionary. I love it, though. They're just so proud of themselves. These overconfident jocks that love the smell of their own wet farts. That's why I've always had an appreciation for the greatness that was the Varsity Club gimmick. Best work of Rotunda's career, bar none. Easily one of my favorite things Sullivan ever did in his career. And as far as Stallion and Dr. Death goes in their match, it was pretty much what you figured it would be. I mean, it wasn't a completely one-sided squash for Dr. Death. Stallion actually got a few hope spots in there. I would more so coin it a prolonged enhancement match. Not so unlike what we saw a couple weeks ago when George South wrestled Ric Flair on television. But there really wasn't much of no going on, outside the occasional interference from Sullivan on the floor. Kind of gave the camera team more of a window to do crowd shots, just to make it look like there was something exciting actually going on in the building. But eventually Williams misses a diving headbutt. Stallion made a very abrupt, concise comeback, which was ill-fated. And then Williams caught Stallion coming off the ropes, hoisted him up overhead for a running stampede. 1, 2, 3. I think that was the first time I've ever seen Dr. Death attempt a diving headbutt. I wasn't used to seeing him go high risk like that. I mean, it was fine for what it was. Easily could have shaved off 5 minutes from it, but I guess they had to fill 2 hours with something. And then we come back for a Magnum TA JYD interview. And, oh yeah. You remember how I briefly mentioned the other week that Ivan and Nikita versus Russian Assassin match they've been building up for Starrcade? How that whole thing basically got undercut when Nikita decided to leave the NWA like 3 weeks beforehand? So yeah, Nikita left. And they made such a passing mention about it here. It almost sounded like Magnum TA was ribbing us. He was basically like, yeah, so Paul Jones ran Nikita out of the NWA. And now Uncle Ivan's been left without a partner. That is, until the junkyard dog stepped up to save the day. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there like, wait, whoa, hold on a sec. Back up. What happened? Nikita's just gone? Yep. Yep, that is exactly what happened. He just took his ball and left. I don't believe they shot an angle. There was really no explanation as to what happened. Nikita is just gone from the company. Kind of like how he did the same thing earlier in the year when he came back looking more clean cut and about 50 pounds lighter. So we had JYD with Magnum here to, I guess, somehow explain how he's going to team with Uncle Ivan at Starrcade and try to make sense out of it. And without getting too bogged down on the verbiage here, I mean, it is Dog we're talking about. He basically infers that Nikita called him and asked him to fill a spot for Starrcade. And since Dog was already passing through the North Kakalaki area, he just figured, sure, why not? I've always had a soft spot for wanting to help my Russian peers. And he went through a couple of his classic one-liners. Every dog needs a bone to chew on, blah, blah. He was, he was still the dog. He had that magnetic on-screen charisma that you just couldn't teach. Spiritually, he was still JYD. Physically and mentally, though, that was a whole different matter. I mean, and I kind of referred a little bit to this on the TBS reviews. When Dog showed up here in 1988, I mean, you weren't getting the 1981, 1982 Midsouth version of JYD. You were getting physically broken down, mentally unstable, the bloom is off the rose 1988 version of JYD. Just wasn't the same. And once he took off his jacket here and you could just see how he looked, it was sad. And to be honest with you, outside the 88 Starrcade pay-per-view, But now I'm struggling to remember what the hell Dog even did afterwards. I think he stuck around a little bit, but I don't think he lasts all that long into 89 before he gets fired for no-showing one of the Clash events. When was he gone? Like February or March? And like with even the way they introduced him here, it was just so flat. It was like, okay, here's the Dog. His NWA debut. Just randomly have him waltz in for an interview segment with Magnum to talk about Ivan Koloff. That's what you came up with for him? Okay. And to be fair, this all tied in with the next match with Ivan and Paul Jones. God, I think this might be the first time we've seen Paul Jones wrestle since what? Starrcade 86? When he and Jimmy Valiant had their hair match? When I read the wiki description for this thing, and I saw it was like 9 minutes in total, God, I almost shit myself. I was like, how in the world is Ivan Koloff going to get 9 minutes out of working with Paul fucking Jones? Well, the one thing I didn't take into account here was that it was Ivan wrestling with one arm tied behind his back. So there was a lot of milking going on here. I mean, whether you want to call this a match or an extended heat angle, because it's kind of your prerogative. Overall, I don't know, it was Ivan Koloff versus Paul Jones in 1988. I hope to God you weren't expecting a miracle to take place because you weren't getting one. At most, you got a passable TV match that was mainly just about setting up the post-match afterbirth so JYD could run out and save the day. I mean, Paul spent most of the match taking a powder on the floor and trying to avoid Ivan at all costs, despite the fact that Ivan was still fighting at a 50% handicap. And it ends up with Paul pulling out a gimmick from his ring trunks to try to strike Ivan in the throat. And after he goes for it the second time, Ivan stops him. He ends up stealing his gimmick and then blatantly using it on Paul Jones right in front of Teddy Long. So I presume this was a no DQ match since Ivan got the pin on him. Either that or Teddy didn't give a shit. And or he didn't know the rules to the match himself, which is entirely possible. And so after Ivan pins him, the assassins hit the ring and start ganging up on him. Also, that way JYD could make the valiant save, about an hour too late. After the assassins had already come off the middle rope with a double team move and drove their knee into Ivan's face, here comes Dog, just casually getting into the ring with his chain, standing around looking like he showed up for a family Christmas reunion, with his fucking pullover gray sweater and black jeans. You know what's funny? I actually read about this after I watched the show. If you try to go watch this Clash event on the old WWE network, I think they clipped like 7 whole minutes out of this match. So the entire runtime is like 90 seconds. I think they show Ivan getting his arm tied behind his back at the very beginning. They added out like 6 straight minutes of nothing. And then they show the angle at the very end when Paul pulled out the gimmick from his pants and everything that led up to the finish afterwards. So even the old network wasn't confident enough to air the whole match. I can just imagine what the fans were thinking in the venue at the time. Like coming out of that 15-minute snooze fest with Dr. Death and the Italian Stallion. Now they have to sit through another 10 minutes of Ivan Koloff and Paul Jones doing slow lumbering offense. At that point, if I were a fan that bought a ticket to see that show, I'd be saying to myself, that main event with Wyndham and Flair versus the Midnights better be the greatest fucking tag match of all time. Those was, I'm going to be slashing some tires in the parking lot after this show's over. Now, things picked up a little bit with the action that followed. What was supposed to be Dusty Rhodes versus the Animal for the sole custody of the six-man tag belts, if you were following along in the Saturday TBS timeline. Turns out that stipulation really didn't mean jack shit by the end of this brawl. I'm not even sure if anybody actually mentioned the six-man tag titles offhand. If they did, it was a fleeting mention. Now, there's obviously a lot that went into this match beyond the stupid six-man tag titles, so maybe I shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. I mean, the titles were utterly meaningless to this whole equation. This is all about Dusty getting a modicum of revenge over the Road Warriors and that infamous spike angle on the previous Superstation. And we covered pretty extensively that whole angle and everything it led to as a result, including the termination of Dusty's contract after Starrcade. So he shows up here with the eye patch and immediately goes after Animal before the bell. You kind of had to figure that it was never going to be much of a match to begin with. I mean, in hindsight, it was actually booked quite perfectly. Went about 2 minutes. It was a knockdown, drag-out street fight where both guys are tearing into each other and not really giving a shit about roles or professionalism. Also, apparently not really giving a shit about selling. But that's par for the course when you're talking about Dusty Rhodes. So they get to the spot where Teddy gets bumped. Animal is seen going after Dusty's eye patch and trying to rip off the padding. But then Dusty reverses it and gets on top of Animal so he can start gouging his eyes. And that's where we get the whole melee with Hawk running in. Eventually you get Sting hitting the ring to help out Dusty. Crowd is going batshit for all of this, by the way. I can't overstate that enough. I mean, it was the hottest they were for anything that happened since they saw Eddie Gilbert back in match 1. So, well, we end up with Dusty going after Animal's leg with one of the ringside chairs. I think that's how he got disqualified. Even though Teddy could clearly see Hawk and Sting interfering just moments prior, apparently it was the chair that Teddy took issue with. So, Hawk theoretically wins the match. Or Animal, I'm sorry, not Hawk. Also, theoretically, the Road Warriors now own the property of these six-man tag titles. Will that ever be something they address on television? Don't give your hopes up. But this did at least set up Dusty and Sting versus the Road Warriors for Starrcade. And like I said, I had no issue with the booking here. The problem, I think, is that, this is all stemming after we just saw 2 underwhelming matches in a row. So even though the crowd loved this, even if I in particular didn't really have an issue with it, I could see how if you're somebody that looks at these Clash events and expects more of the pay-per-view caliber matches, or at the very least more than what we get on the studio shows in terms of boring squash, promo, lather, rinse, repeat. Yeah, this kind of underdelivered. But, as a way to push the Starrcade event and try to heat up the big profile matches, I had no qualms with what they did here. At least they turned it around and closed with a banger. Again, while I will never understand how in the fuck they went how many weeks without even remotely mentioning each other's names on television, the lack of advertising for this thing was criminal. However, Ric Flair and Barry Windham versus the Midnight Express was fucking outstanding. From the moment Bobby Eaton popped Flair in the mouth with that slap, I popped myself. Much of my anatomy popped watching that, as a matter of fact. That is when I knew this was going to be great. And you know, I mean, I don't want to immediately start this review on a dour note. But shit, man, I look at the talent involved here, and I think back to everything that they had already started in the fall season after the Bash Tour. God, it makes me so frustrated when I think about what could have been with that Midnight's Horseman program. Then Tully and Arn left, and we never got a proper resolution. And I know I love to get on my soapbox every so often and talk about how, man, you never truly see great tag team wrestling like this anymore. And once every 5 or 6 years, you get that diamond in the rough like an FTR versus Juice Robinson and Jay White series, or FTR and the Briscoes, where the chemistry is there, the matches flow like clockwork, and it winds up being a classic series of matches that you can go back and relive anytime, and it never gets old. And the problem, though, is, well, a lot of those are rarities in modern wrestling. This show had 2 phenomenal tag team matches on the card. Easily. And I think the reason this stood out to me the way it did, I honestly don't recall if I've ever seen this match prior to watching it here. Which I know sounds crazy because I'm a huge Midnight Express fanatic. How in the world wouldn't you remember a Midnight's versus Flair Wyndham tag match from the Clash of Champions? Well, again, aside from the poor advertising, probably because the rest of the card was so forgettable, I probably just wrote off the entire show and said, well, it wasn't the Midnights and the Fantastics from the Clash back in March, so who cares? But I would say I enjoyed this even better than I did the Fantastics match from the Clash of Champions back in March. And that was a damn good tag match too. And obviously, yeah, I could go blow for blow and talk about the whole 17-minute timeline if I wanted to. And I always prefer focusing on the bigger picture in matches and not get so tied up on the Dave Meltzer approach of this high-risk move that should have feasibly killed somebody, followed by this high-risk move that also should have feasibly killed somebody. I mean, God, there were so many brilliant moments in this match from both teams. And like the one thing that immediately jumps out to me is that, excluding that 2 or 3 minute match the Midnights had with the Road Warriors right before dropping the World Tag Belts, I think this was the first time we saw Bobby and Stan working as full-fledged babyfaces, right? I mean, you can't really gauge the match with the Road Warriors properly because, the Midnights never even got out of the gate. They just sold for Hawk and Animal the whole time and got beat flat. But in terms of actually working and letting the heels appropriately call spots, which is always a traditional thing for the heels to do in wrestling, I think this is their first rodeo, at least in terms of working with bigger high-profile talents. Bobby in particular was breaking out all kinds of new innovative stuff here that we never saw him do as a heel. Of course, anytime he's in there working with Flair, the work is flawless. That goes without saying. I mean, man, if you're going to check out anything in this match, dude, you have to go back and watch the back and forth between Bobby Eaton and Ric Flair. They just... it's virtually impossible to describe. They just gel like they've been working together for 15 to 20 years. And like they just knew each other inside and out. And that's not to discredit the work from Barry Windham or Stan Lane here, because they were great in this match too. But Beautiful Bobby stole the show. He was on a level above everybody else, including Flair. And even during some of the moments here where things didn't always click, Most notably, the couple of times Barry tried to bump for the Midnights and had no idea how the hell he was supposed to take the move or where he was going. My favorite was a spot where Stan tried to karate kick him in the gut. Barry sold it like somebody had shot him out of a cannon. He takes this comical leaping bump over the top rope to the floor. Meanwhile, if you go back and look, Stan barely grazed him with his fucking kick. It was so over the top. I know Stan did a little bit of karate in his younger years. It's not like he faked knowing how to do Muay Thai kicks or anything like that. God, a lot of them look like shit. That was probably the one thing about the match that rubbed me the wrong way. Like, anytime Stan tried to do a karate kick to the heels, I was like, please, Stan, just stop with the fucking karate kicks. They look horrible. But really, that was my only gripe about it. There was so much ebb and flow to this match. I mean, it was immaculate. They knew when to pick things up. They knew when to let the babyfaces control the pace. They knew when to slow it down and let the heels get some heat so the crowd could rally behind the Midnights to get them more involved. It was just perfect pro wrestling, dude. And you get just enough involvement from JJ and Cornette where, it never got overwhelming or excessive. The camera work wasn't all that great, which is probably another criticism I had about the match. Like, several moments throughout here where the floor cam is just missing key shots or being out of position to capture things. I'll talk about the finish momentarily because they missed a fucking heat spot that led up to the finish, which made me furious. But after Flair and Windham had extensively worked over Bobby, Stan's able to get the hot tag. He actually made a great comeback too, even though it was short-lived. And right as things break down at the end with all four guys, there's a deal where JJ tries to take off his shoe so he can hit one of the baby faces, but Corny cuts him off with a pass, so he grabs a handful of JJ and starts choking him. Meanwhile, Flair's able to grab the shoe and then clock Bobby over the head with it behind Tommy Young's back, so that way Windham can crawl over on Eaton and steal the pinfall. And again, everything they did there in that heat sequence was great. But the problem was the cameraman was too busy filming the managers fighting on the floor, so they missed Flair actually hitting Eaton over the head with a shoe. It's like, who's operating this production? Someone from the old TNA regime? But it was a good heat finish. And you had to make sure that Flair and Windham went over here. They're the two main title holders going into Starrcade. You got to protect them as much as possible before the big pay-per-view. I mean, the Midnights weren't the champions at this point. They could afford to eat the loss. And they didn't lose clean, so it's not like it hurt their momentum or their credibility before the match with the original Midnights. They did have Paul Lee in one of those insets during this match here, cutting a promo. I would say improper placement, if I'm being kind about it. There's a time and a place to air pre-tapes like that, and this was not the match to do it. It was a good promo, just not here, guys. And when I look back, is it a 5-star classic that ranks among the all-time great tag matches? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I guess it kind of depends on how your grading scale works. For something that was poorly built up on television they gave no expectation for, well, then this is a fucking 8-star classic by those standards. Because this well exceeded expectations. I mean, I love this match so much, I went back and watched it again after the show was over. That's how much fun I had with it. Now, did it set up anything long-term for 89? No, not really. I think there might have been a few Ric Flair, Bobby Eaton singles matches they booked for house shows or spot shows in early 89. But again, we're entering that stage where we're seeing a lot of talent shift going on. You know, Barry Windham's pretty much gone by February-ish of 89. JJ's not too far behind. The Horsemen aren't even really a thing after Starrcade anyway. I mean, they've pretty much been disbanded since Tully and Arn left. They're only starting to now acknowledge the cracks in the system. And for the Midnights, you know, they kind of get into that limbo phase in early 89 where after the original Midnights thing falls through, I think there's a brief window between late spring and right before the Bash season starts where Cornette, Lane, and Eaton aren't even on television. Can't remember the logistics of how all that went down, but I know Bobby was dealing with a couple injury complications around that time. So, I mean, yeah, this was kind of a one-and-done blow-off. And I think it was done on purpose. So, as a fan, especially if you're an advocate of both teams, you were probably hoping for a lot more, but it never came to be, unfortunately. Overall, I would say this is a Clash event that you absolutely should check out for the outer portions of the card. Everything in the middle you can effectively skip. Definitely go watch the main event. That is a tag team classic that every wrestling school should require their trainees to watch. And then write an essay and report on why everything about that match was correct and why everything about modern tag team wrestling is mostly wrong and stupid. I mean, it's why I have such an appreciation for going back and watching these classic shows again. Especially in Midsouth. You know what I can always bank on? No matter how much bad shit's going on in the world of modern wrestling, I can always look forward to the next episode of Midsouth Television. Even if it's not a banger of a show, at least I know it's not going to outright suck dick and or piss me off. It's the best day of the week. Right as I'm uploading the Monday podcast and getting that whole thing going, I sit back and watch Midsouth TV while the show's going up to YouTube and Rumble. It's the best hour of the week. Sometimes hour and a half, depending on how much time I'm taking with my notes. And after how great last week was, I was really looking forward to seeing how they followed up with everything. Or, you know, at least a good chunk of what they started. I wasn't expecting them to cover every solitary detail from last week. You know, they could easily spread a lot of this story over the next few weeks to give it room to breathe. The biggest thing going on right now, I would argue, is the current direction they're taking with Krusher Darsow. And this weird infatuation he seems to have with Nicolai Volkoff. And Watts broke a lot of this down while Krusher was wrestling Doug Vines in the opener this week. I mean, really, the whole thing kind of boils down to Darsow being really impressed with the strength and power ability of Volkoff after having wrestled him on television. Remember, Darsow's only been beaten twice on Mid-South. Once by Volkoff, the other by the Junkyard Dog. And last week, Darsow did that interview with Watts, claiming that, well, he could match Dog power for power. It was just the ring experience that Darsow didn't have, which is why Dog beat him. But he couldn't even get out of the gate when he was wrestling Nicolai. He just dominated him at every turn. And a lot of Darsow's obsession with Volkoff kind of embodies the powerlifting game. You know, Watts talked a lot about the Olympics here and mentioned that the Russians always seem to have an advantage over the Americans in form of powerlifting and weight training. We actually got a Dave Schultz reference here, which was kind of neat. Oddly enough, no. It's not the David Schultz you're probably thinking of. The guy that punked out the reporter John Stossel in MSG in 1984. Now, they were actually two entirely different people. But, and again, we're still in that pre-Russian sympathizer phase. He's still working and getting babyface reactions in his matches. The announcers are still putting him over. But you got that lingering question in the back of your head, what exactly is going on with Darsow? It's one thing to admire the ability of a Russian powerhouse, but to go out there and start scouting his matches in person, it's a little suspect. Well, as Watts noted in the next segment, we finally learned of his true colors. Now, obviously last week, they announced a huge match for this week between Nicolai and Dr. Death's Steve Williams. Since that was the advertised main event, they wanted to make sure they gave it ample time here, so they put it on second. Oh, by the way, just for clarity's sake, Darsow beat Vines with the overhead bear hug. I don't really know if that needed clarification, but there you go. So this match was kind of a unique test for Dr. Death. It's no secret he was still greener than a pepper tree at this point. So, putting him in there against a guy like Nicolai Volkoff, that was always going to be a challenge for Williams. I can't in good consciousness say this is a particularly great or even good match. It definitely accomplished what it needed to by the end. The story was all about Darsow's involvement once they did the ref bump with Pee Wee Anderson, or as Watts referred to him here as, that little referee. Yes, Pee Wee Anderson was quite scrawny in 1983. Some of y'all might not remember just how fucking tiny that guy was back in the 80s. He ballooned up a lot during the Nitro years, but in 1983, he earned the nickname Pee Wee. So he gets absolutely demolished by Dr. Death when he went for a flying shoulder tackle spot. Nicolai goes to throw Steve over the top rope. Darsow immediately goes over and hoists him up into an overhead backbreaker. Meanwhile, you see Nicolai calling the shots in the ring, making it totally apparent that they had everything pre-planned beforehand, and this whole attack was a work in progress. They were just buying their time and waiting for the right chance for Darsow to pick his spot. So after Dr. Death gets thrown back in the ring, Nicolai beats him down for another minute as Pete was climbing back in. Then he ends up giving him the power slam for the 3 count. I can never undersell the fucking incredible strength power of Nicolai Volkoff. The fact that he could just muscle up a guy like Steve Dr. Death Williams and make it look like he was manhandling a cruiserweight. The thing is, you don't really see it visually on camera because everybody was fucking ginormous around this time. But you think about it. Darsow was what? 6'4", 300 pounds. Volkoff towered over him easily. Steve was somewhere around 290, I think. And he definitely trimmed down a bit during the later stages of his career, but by this point, he still had to be pushing 3 bills. And there's Nicolai standing across the ring just totally dwarfing these two guys. It makes you think, if you were alive today standing across the ring from some of the modern athletes, you'd look like Andre on stilts. So anyway, yes, we have now learned that Krusher Darsow is a piece of shit scumbag who works for the Russian coalition. And whereas normally I would be booing this traitor for demeaning his American roots, if it means getting him out of those fucking Daisy Dukes any quicker, I'm all for it. So, boo Darsow for turning heel, but cheer Darsow for the upcoming new ring gear. Then we came back for a Midnight Express match with Lanny Poffo and Josh Stroud. So apparently that Lanny Poffo Magnum TA pairing was a one-off deal all along. Actually, it was funny. I was listening to Brian Last on the Midsouth Pod review with Mike Mills the other week. I wanted to hear his take on some of this stuff because I know he was an avid Midsouth watcher back in the day. It's always nice to hear second opinions too. He actually brought up something that I really didn't even consider when it came to the whole Wrestling 2 Magnum TA Lanny Poffo dynamic. I mean, I just kind of wrote it off as Wrestling 2 being a bitter, disgruntled coach that hated the idea of Magnum and Lanny teaming together simply because Wrestling 2 thought Magnum was better served as a singles competitor. But then I remember the contract status of Randy Savage around this point because he had not gone to the WWF yet. That wasn't until 85. And I always forget there's that brief window in 84 where he wrestled in Memphis. Brian actually brought up something that I kind of overlooked. It kind of looked like they were teasing a Poffos versus Magnum TA Wrestling 2 storyline. Like, the option was there on the table at one point that Bill Watts was actually going to bring in Savage to Mid-South. That he wanted to do that feud. God, could you have imagined the possibilities of what they could have done with Lanny and Randy Poffo as a tag team in Mid-South? Christ, they could have wrestled the Midnight Express at some point. Can you imagine how great those matches would have been? Now, of course, the question is, why didn't it happen? Well, there was the controversy with everything that happened between Randy and Bill Dundee the year prior. Remember, there was a story about them getting into a fight in a parking lot in Memphis. And it wasn't anything storyline related. It was an actual shoot fight. I think Savage knocked Dundee's front teeth out or something like that. And of course, the problem was that Dundee was about to come into Mid-South as the head booker as we go into 84. So because of the beef between those two, I think Watts instinctually knew that it wasn't a good idea to bring in Savage. So we never got Randy Savage in Mid-South, unfortunately. But like just the fact that they were even teasing that as a possibility at one point, that's the thing that blows my mind. Like, it was right there. They mentioned Randy's name on television like 3 times last week. But it never came to be. So I think they just scrapped the whole Magnum Lanny tag team idea and said, yeah, we'll just pretend that segment didn't happen. Moving on. So, of course, I'm watching Lanny work with beautiful Bobby and Loverboy Dennis here. I'm getting more and more depressed at the fact that we never saw Midnight's versus Poffos feud in Mid-South. We kind of talked about the different ring style that the Midnights were bringing to the Mid-South area by this point. Kind of a more updated, modified, faster pace that would start to become the new norm for Mid-South as we move into 84. Kind of a stronger focus on the more athletic guys that weren't necessarily big, tough men, but you could still buy them as credible athletes. And that's something Watts mentioned on commentary here when it came to the Midnight stature. And like last week, just a simple showcase match to put over Bobby and Dennis. Corny got to do the ring intros again, which became a staple of the Midnight's matches in the future. He was not dressed in the ridiculous suit colors by this point. He was just an ordinary, well-tailored, spoiled rich kid. He also didn't have the blaring personality here that we would all come to know and love years later. He was still great on the stick. But, yeah, you could tell he was still trying to find his comfort zone with displaying the full Jim Cornette persona. And part of that, I think, was him wanting to make a good impression on Bill Watts. At the same time, not wanting to go overboard with the gimmick from out of the gate. He still wanted to maintain a professional, reserved attitude. So, took him a while for him to open up a bit more on camera, but he eventually figured it out. Then we had Magnum TA going over Frank Levert in a match that kind of forgot happened until I read my notes here again. Not that the match really mattered. This was all about Lanny joining Boyd Pierce on commentary to, I guess, clear the air of all the controversy surrounding last week. Talked about his family here. Actually mentioned Angelo and Randy by name. He sort of tiptoed around the insider terminology as best he could to get the point across. You know, he's not proud of everything his family represents. He himself has tried to dissociate from a lot of the negative publicity in order to create a legacy for himself. And while he still wrestles under the Poffo name, he doesn't really follow in the footsteps of the Poffo family anymore. Now, of course, when you listen to him here, you have to sort of read between the lines to figure out what exactly Lanny means when he says negative publicity or not being proud of the Poffo heritage. I mean, if you know your territory history and the kind of promotion ICW was, it makes a lot of sense contextually. Of course, I'm not going to get into the specifics of all that now. Otherwise, we'd be here for another fucking hour. I think the big problem with all this is that, you know, we really didn't have a lot of time to explain what the hell was even going on here. Because, like, right as he was about to get more specific on the family issues, well, the match was over, and then Boyd was like, all right, we'll be back after these commercial messages. So poor Lanny didn't even really get much of a platform to talk about any of this stuff. But he essentially gets over the fact that, you know, Mr. Wrestling 2 aired a lot of unnecessary dirty laundry last week. Lanny's focused on trying to move beyond all the family drama. So, you know, if Magnum is still interested in being his tag partner, he's still open-minded about it. But Wrestling 2 is going to have to drop all the family browbeating. And again, a lot of this is a coulda, woulda, shoulda scenario. Speculation. You know, we talked about how Randy doesn't actually come into Midsouth at any point. So whatever plans they were trying to run with here never really came to pass. I assume the idea would have been to have Wrestling 2 and Magnum work as the heels in that program, had it ever gotten off the ground. Kind of weird to speculate on what Magnum TA as a heel would have been like. But that seemed to be the direction they were going at the time. And I don't remember how long they're going to run with all this before it just gets dropped. But I have to assume Watts was really serious about doing this storyline. Right up until he found out Dundee was coming in, and then he was like, you know, on second thought, maybe we ought to scrap that. We also had Wrestling 2 in action this week. He took on the Missing Link. God, when I saw the graphic flash up for this match, I was like, I've got to see what the hell Wrestling 2 can get out of the Missing Link. Odds are not much. I mean, the whole thing was just psychological warfare from 2. Anytime he would tease the knee lift on Link, Link would have a spasm or he would cower back in the corner. It actually wasn't a bad match at all. You know, the story of Link trying to avoid the running knee lift the whole time actually led to some pretty cool moments. You know, like the one spot where Link got hit with a quick one and then bailed out to the floor. And then right as he went to headbutt the ring post, he had to stop and think about it again. Because he's used to headbutting the turnbuckle pads. Of course, Watts is like, hey, go right ahead, Link. See how that works out for you, brother. And they did some back and forth stuff at the end that looked all right. You know, Link had Wrestling 2 staggered at a couple points, but when he went up and missed a diving headbutt, 2 was able to set up the knee lift in the corner to get the 3 count. So I think we can write this one off as a moderately successful Missing Link TV match. All thanks to Mr. Wrestling 2. My spirit animal on these Mid-South television programs. He never disappoints. And that took us to Hacksaw Duggan and Tom Lentz. You know the first thing I thought of when I saw Tom Lentz here? Why the hell didn't they give this guy a fake Russian gimmick? Instead of fucking Boris Zurkov. I'd have bought Tom Lentz as a fake Russian sympathizer. He actually kind of looked like Ivan Koloff if Ivan were like 4 inches taller. I mean, it was a TV squash. Duggan won very easily with a spear. And that set up Jim Ross coming into the ring afterwards to interview Duggan, which had the best conversation starter line I've ever heard. JR gets into the ring and goes, Jim Duggan. Duggan responds with, What? What do you want? It was perfect delivery. Look, Duggan was not in the mood to talk here, but JR was determined to get his interview in. And of course, Duggan did the interview anyway. And they did not, in fact, mention anything about Ted DiBiase's cameo the other week. Instead, Duggan talked about Krusher Darsow and everything that we saw earlier with him in the program. Stooping low enough as to side with a Russian. And from where Duggan stands, you don't do something like that and get off scot-free. As a matter of fact, Duggan considers Darsow a marked man in the Shreveport area. And he's going to TCB the American way. See, I know my acronyms. TCB. Taking care of business. Aren't you all proud of me? Keep it up with my Gen Z terminology. Oh yeah, and by the way, not to totally gloss over the DiBiase thing, yeah, that's another story angle that just kind of goes nowhere. They literally shot a pre-tape of him cutting a promo on Duggan the other week, teasing that he was coming back to the Midsouth area to beat him up. And then he just doesn't come back. At least not until well into next year, if not early 85. So Duggan didn't even respond to that. He's like, fuck that guy. I want to talk about Darsow. So how apropos, as we come back from commercial, we got Krusher Darsow standing by in the ring with Jim Ross. And this is his chance to set the record straight and explain what his mindset is right now. You know, a month or so back, he turned down $500 from General Skandar Akbar in a ploy to get him to turn against the Junkyard Dog. He stood up for himself. And now he's a turncoat. He's aligned with the Russian nightmare Nicolai Volkoff. So, you know, Darsow goes into his tirade. Cough, cough, tirade. As only Krusher Darsow knew how to raise his voice and sound mad. He talks about how he did in fact turn down Akbar's money, and it was a conscious decision at the time. But JYD never repaid Darsow. He says that he's been in secret training with Nicolai the whole time. He knows that he'll offer Darsow more than anybody else in the Mid-South area ever could. And with those two at the helm, nobody can stop them. And as you'd expect, Bill Watts made sure to get in his political viewpoints to talk about the stupidity of this decision on Darsow's part. Without getting too specific, we can just chalk it up to karma's a bitch. And, I mean, in hindsight, was it a good promo? Oh, fuck no. It's horrible. But again, it's the content versus context argument. Did it accomplish what it needed to? Sure. Was Barry Darsow starring in the next Hollywood featured film for his acting ability here? Only if Neil Breen is directing it. If you're really trying to cherry pick things, is the whole situation kind of bullshit? Yeah. Like, the idea that Darsow turned on the Mid-South heroes just because JYD didn't return the favor when Darsow helped him out like a month and a half ago. Do people even remember that angle offhand? I remember Darsow turning down Akbar for $500. I do not really remember the details of him coming out to save JYD from a mass beatdown. Especially when we see mass beatdowns on every single fucking television program. They all just kind of blend together after a while. But I get the decision. From a booking standpoint, Darsow was really stale as a vanilla babyface. At least this would give him a chance to run with something different and work closely with Nicolai on television. Because those two were training together, and Nicolai was probably helping Darsow out with a lot of stuff, just getting him more comfortable as an on-screen personality. So I definitely agree with the heel turn. The delivery of the promo could have been better, but pick and choose your battles. And that led us to the final standby with Tonga and King Carl Fergie versus Mike Jackson and Rick Rude. I still love the way JR introduces the Barbarian. From the Isle of Tonga, from the Book of Redundancy. So next week on TV, we're going to see Jerry Lawler work a match. So, of course, Bill Watts is selling the appearance by mentioning the Andy Kaufman story and talking about his history with Lawler. Still, in my personal opinion, one of the top 3 greatest professional storylines of all time. And that'll be cool, seeing Lawler in Mid-South. Not really much to the match. It went to a draw because they ran out of TV time. But it was a fun little scrap for the time it got. I really like watching Jackson working there with the Barbarian. That was a wild dynamic. I know Rude is shortly on his way out for Memphis pretty soon, so he's not going to be sticking around too much longer after this. The Barbarian, I know he ends up in Crockett Promotions sometime in late 85. Not sure how much longer he sticks around here. It's just so amazing when you go back and look at the talent pool from 1983 and 1984. Like just the idea that guys like Rick Rude and the Barbarian at this point were just working standby matches on television just to fill time. And look at the stars they turned out to be. I know that's how everybody gets their foot in the door. But at the same time, not everybody grows into a major name like so many of these guys did when they were first starting out. And that's always the fun part of going back and watching the early careers of so many of these big names. And then seeing who they become later on when they got different gimmicks and new personas. And this show wasn't going to be as hot as the other week, especially with all those stories they started. But this was mainly about facilitating the Krusher Darsow heel turn. Not really much in the way of moving the needle for any other major story advancement. But they pretty much established Darsow's first major feud now as a heel. He and Nicolai are going to be going after Duggan and JYD. And Magnum TA and Wrestling 2 obviously have their own thing going on. The only issue, like we said, is the fact that nothing ever really comes of the stuff they're currently building up with the Poffo family. So all we can really do is speculate on what might have happened. But you see how things are shaping up really well for 1984. The product has an edge to it again. There's an excitement factor about what might happen with a lot of these feuds and stories. And they're still bringing in new faces to the territory. The Midnights have only been there for 2 weeks. But you can already see that they're going to be big players. They're already presented differently than the other talent. There's a uniqueness to their matches that separates them from the rest of the locker room. So it's a thrilling time for Midsouth now. The new changes are coming, and you can sense it with every passing show. All right. So we are officially getting to see the first set of the Reunion Arena tapings here for World Class. The Thanksgiving Star Wars special. Kind of a shorter episode in the taping block this week. They had 3 matches they aired for the card. The main event being Rick Rude and the Iceman for the American Heavyweight title. By the way, I just thought about this. Did they ever show how Rude won the American Heavyweight title in the first place? Like, I remember they aired that pre-tape where he and Percy were talking about beating the Iceman for the belt. I don't believe they actually ever aired a clip of the title change. Come to think of it, have we seen Rick Rude carry the American Heavyweight title at all? He never wears it to the ring for his Dallas matches. If you're wondering how I even remembered who the previous champion was, you can chalk it up to me having a great memory, because they have done a horrible job explaining how anything in this feud is developed. And we'll get to that in a bit. I do want to briefly touch on some of these prelim matches. The opener for the card was the Grappler and the Missing Link versus Dave Peterson and Johnny Mantell. I don't know if the Grappler is officially a part of Percy's dynasty. He may have just been filling in as the designated heel partner. Overall, there's not too much to note about it. Percy and the Link were continuing to show some chemistry problems throughout the match. And they had alluded to some of those problems last week when Link and Rick Rude were having trouble getting on the same page in their tag match. Most of the issues here stem from Percy not being able to control Link or keep him in their corner. I mean, you could see they're obviously setting up some kind of face turn for the Missing Link. It's, it's really not comparable in any way now that I think of it. But it's kind of similar to the Varsity Club Rick Steiner feud in Crockett, where you got the wild, out-of-control athlete being abused by his coach and his teammates. Even though he may not be the brightest bulb in the drawer, he's got a likable charm to his personality that the people admire. I know we're talking about the Missing Link here, so take it with a grain of salt. But you see Percy getting visibly frustrated that the Missing Link isn't following orders and just seems to be off doing his own thing during the entire match. But, it's the Missing Link. What do you expect? Following orders was never that guy's strong suit, no matter who's managing him. Maybe Skandar Akbar being the only exception to the rule. So they get to the spot where Link gets himself trapped in the ring ropes during the babyface flurry. Somehow the Grappler is able to tag back in and then start working over Mantell. And then after Mantell goes for a leapfrog, but the Grappler stops it, he hits him with a lariat and pins him. And naturally, Percy's very content with the result, even though the Missing Link really didn't do jack shit to help out with the victory. Again, you see what the end goal is with the story. Percy's great. He was the best part of the whole segment. It is kind of bizarre to think they've literally just started the whole Pringle Dynasty storyline in Dallas. Now they're already teasing dissension with group members after, 2 months? I don't even know if they revealed all the faction members at this point. So far, the entire team has been Rick Rude and the Missing Link. Possibly the Grappler, but we're so not sure. He's in his seasonal residence. And I guess we'll see where they take this Link stuff going into 86. This is where we've come in world-class wrestling. A missing Link face turn. Yeah. Times were very rough. Then we had Lance Von Erich versus Killer Tim Brooks. So we did in fact get a featured spot on the Reunion Arena card for Lance. Against a guy who's literally been off of television for seemingly months. God, I can't even recall the last time Tim Brooks wrestled a match in World Class. When was he involved with Gary Hart, One Man Gang, and Mark Lewin? I know you're all thinking, who? I don't blame you. So this is blink and you miss it short. They teased a handshake at the very beginning. Brooks tried to get the jump on Lance. I briefly looked away to finish some notes on the previous tag match we just watched. And then all of a sudden, I'm watching David Manning call for the bell as Lance has Brooks in a sleeper hold. So they really wanted to keep this brief and succinct. I mean, I can't really grade or critique it because it was so damn quick, but the people fought for the finish. Lance is still somehow over with the Texas fans. I mean, it's just hard to gauge whether or not they kept it short because they wanted to put Lance over in a big way, or maybe they didn't have faith that he'd be able to work a long match with Killer Tim Brooks. Either way, you can tell the reality is quickly setting in for Lance Von Erich. He's already getting swarmed by the rabid Texan fans. And, to say that he looks uncomfortable would probably be underselling it. He is a celebrity now, whether he wants to be or not. And when it comes to Rick Rude and the Iceman in the main event for the American Heavyweight belt, I guess you would coin this the Iceman's rematch since losing the belt to Rude about a month or two back. Rude was sporting some relatively interesting-looking rainbow-colored tights for the occasion. I think Mercer summed it up perfectly on commentary. They don't quite fit, yet somehow they fit the personality at the same time. It took me a minute, but I think I figured out what he was going for. A little tight around the nether regions, if you know what I'm saying. We saw more of Rick Rude than we wanted to here. Again, Percy was a star of the whole segment, constantly drawing attention to himself on the floor and just being the best obnoxious heat magnet in the world. And the match was still good, don't get me wrong. I had so much fun watching Percy react to everything, though. Constantly shit-talking the people. And Mercer actually claimed he was more obnoxious and more vocal than Jim Cornette ever was in Dallas. Yeah, not entirely untrue. JC was great. But even he wasn't showing this much flair and personality on camera in Dallas. Again, the work between Rude and the Iceman was pretty good. You know, King Parsons was like Dusty. No matter how shitty his punches looked or how choreographed the setup for all of his offense was, I mean, he was always going to be over with the Texas fans. I mean, they worked a basic story with Rude targeting the back of the Iceman. Went through a couple comeback sequences where the Iceman tried to get some offense going, but would get shut down. Then finally, Iceman tried for a crossbody out of the corner but missed. Specifically, he landed on his back, yet proceeded to sell his ribs. Interesting. Then Rude kind of capitalized and got the pin while the Iceman was stunned. And that kind of led to this awesome post-match where, again, Percy Pringle was just the sole highlight of the entire show. He's holding up the American Heavyweight belt right in front of Parsons, just mocking him and being a total douche. So the Iceman responds as you would expect. Pops Percy right in the jaw and sends him flailing out of the ring. But of course that leaves the window open for Rude to attack him from behind. And he ends up giving him a rude awakening DDT on the concrete floor, which Bill Mercer sold on commentary like someone had just dropped a cup of coffee in the front row. Oh, geez. Oh, that's unfortunate. That was about his level of concern. A man was dropped face first on concrete. Bill Mercer was like, well, that was different. But it got some heat back on Rude afterwards. People got to see Percy get his comeuppance for all the bad-mouthing he was doing earlier, so yeah, a little bit of something for everybody, I guess. I still don't entirely understand the direction they're going with the missing link. Like the whole involvement with Percy's group. I love the dynamic of him and Rick Rude together. That was such a natural fit. But, yeah. That was a pretty short and concise episode this week. Nothing particularly bad from what we saw, just not all that attention-grabbing. I think next week they're airing the cage match with Kerry and Kevin against Chris and Gino. So that'll be a pretty big deal. I'm sure there will be plenty of shenanigans going on there. If you've been a wrestling fan for years, you can always bet that when there's a cage involved, it'll be interference aplenty. It's the law of nature. But I think a lot of this first taping block was mostly to get over Percy's group and then furthering along their storylines. So it was good the way they pieced it all together. And I think that about rounds everything out. I got nothing left on World Class this week. Probably the shortest review we've ever done. It's not bad, though. So for Monday... Crap, what do we have going on Monday? Let me just pull up my 15,000 tabs right now that I got going on with Chrome and close some of these. I think it's just Retro Raw, right? Because we did the SummerSlam review last week. This WWF in Your House, I don't believe is until... Is it mid-December? December 17th. Okay. So 2 more weeks. So that'll be for them. Yeah, so it's just going to be Retro Raw. Cool. Like it. Good stuff. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and guess we'll catch you all soon. Peace out.